She had the ticket, she had the seat number, she had the brains, the resume, the reason to be there. So why did they still look at her like she didn't belong? 17-year-old Sierra Morgan boarded her international flight with a dream in her pocket to present at one of the most prestigious youth tech summits in the world. But just minutes after sitting down in first class, a flight attendant leaned in with an icy smile and asked her to move. No explanation, no apology, just that polite, sharp tone that says, "You're not one of us." What happens when a young black girl is humiliated at 30,000 feet? Only for the world to discover who her father is and what power he holds. Why didn't Sierra fight back? What did she write that sparked a global reckoning in the airline industry? And how did her quiet resistance become the beginning of something far bigger than revenge? This is not just a story about a seat. This is a story about reclaiming space and rewriting the rules. If you're ready for a story that will make you feel, question, and remember, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. The soft chime of the airport speaker echoed through the high ceilings of Seattle-Tacoma International, calling passengers to board Aerolight Flight 212 to Zurich. Gate agents smiled with well-practiced ease as a small crowd of first-class passengers began lining up. Shoulders relaxed, eyes glazed with the confidence of people who were used to being treated as priorities. Among them stood a girl who didn't quite fit the mold, but didn't seem to mind. Sierra Morgan held her boarding pass with both hands, as if its edges might curl under the weight of her nerves. At 17, she had never flown alone internationally, let alone in first class. Her long box braids were neatly pulled back into a low bun, and her pale gray hoodie read MIT AI Ethics Youth Lab. Not a fashion statement, just a quiet fact. A silver pin on her lapel marked her as a keynote presenter at the International Youth Tech Summit. She adjusted the strap of her canvas backpack and let out a slow breath. The boarding agent scanned her pass and smiled. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Morgan. Seat 2A, right up front." Sierra stepped onto the jet bridge, heart fluttering. The plane, an Aerolight A380, gleamed in the afternoon light, its logo a feathered arc etched in gold. Inside, the cabin exhaled comfort, wide leather seats, honeyed lighting, and the subtle scent of citrus and cedar. She found her seat by the window and carefully slid into it. It cradled her like a hug she didn't expect. She placed her backpack gently at her feet and pulled out her presentation folder. Inside were the slides for her speech, Human Bias in Machine Learning Models, a cross-cultural perspective. It wasn't flashy. It was technical, precise, and she hoped important. Gregory, her father, had told her it could change the way AI was approached in global education systems. "Don't underestimate what your mind can shift," he had said, "even in rooms where people think you don't belong." She looked out the window. The tarmac buzzed with movement, ground crews loading luggage, fueling trucks rumbling below. It felt distant, muted, in her head. She rehearsed her first few lines again. Her throat tightened at the thought of the crowd she'd face in Zurich. Scientists, CEO, educators. She was the youngest presenter at the summit and one of the few black girls. But she was ready. The seat beside her was still empty. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the soft whir of the cabin lull her nerves. Somewhere behind her, a baby began to cry. It reminded her of home, of her little cousin Zuri, who always screamed whenever Sierra left the house. She smiled to herself. The moment felt suspended, sacred. She reached for the tiny glass of orange-infused water already placed at her seat. As she lifted it, her hand trembled just slightly. Not fear. Not exactly. Just the weight of how much this flight meant. It wasn't just a trip. It was a symbol. Suddenly, a burst of laughter pierced the hush. Two voices, loud and unfiltered, entered the cabin. A man and a woman. Their cadence rang with entitlement. I swear to God. "Lena," the man said, chuckling. "The guy actually offered me sparkling cider." I said, "Do I look 12? Sierra turned her head as the couple made their way up the aisle. The man was in his early 20s, tall, with expensive-looking blonde hair styled like it belonged on a GQ cover. His athleisure outfit looked casual, but cost more than Sierra's monthly rent. The woman on his arm wore oversized sunglasses despite being indoors, her lips pouty and pink. She clung to him like he was both an accessory and an asset. They stopped in front of Sierra. The man squinted at her, then at his ticket. "Wait," he said flatly. "Is this seat too?" Sierra blinked. "Yes, that's my seat." He tilted his head. "No, I think this is our row. 2A and B. You sure you're not in the wrong cabin?" His voice wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was polite with disbelief. Like he couldn't imagine that someone like her had actually purchased this seat on purpose. "I'm positive," Sierra replied calmly. "My ticket says 2A. You can check." He did. He looked down, then frowned, then glanced at the woman beside him. Maybe it's a mistake she offered, her voice syrupy. She probably got confused. These terminals can be tricky. Sierra sat still, her heart beginning to beat louder than before. She wasn't confused. She wasn't lost. But their tone, soft, friendly, poisonous, told her she was not expected here. "I'm not confused," Sierra said. "My name is Sierra Morgan. I was assigned this seat by the summit organizers." The man sighed. "Look, no offense, but we're frequent flyers, like top tier. This might be a booking glitch. It happens all the time." At that moment, a flight attendant approached. She was older, composed, with a tidy blonde bob and a name tag that read Marla. She smiled at the couple first. "Hello there, Mr. Hale, Ms. Kingsley. Is everything all right?" "This young woman," Preston said, gesturing to Sierra, "is sitting in our seats. Looks like aero light messed up." Marla's smile faltered slightly as she looked at Sierra. "May I see your boarding pass?" Ma'am Sierra nodded and handed it over. Marla checked it, then looked at Preston's. Her brow furrowed. "Well," she said slowly, "they do both say 2A. I'm so sorry. This doesn't happen often." Sierra tried to steady her breath. Marla smiled. "Tight now. Mr. Hale is one of our Platinum Loyalty members. If you wouldn't mind, Ms. Morgan, I'll find you a seat in our premium economy cabin with extra legroom. I'll make a note for compensation." Sierra stared at her. "I'd prefer to keep the seat I was assigned." Preston chuckled under his breath. Marla's tone shifted slightly. "We really need to resolve this quickly. Ms. Morgan, it's a full flight." Sierra felt the heat rise behind her eyes. So this is what it looked like, being quietly erased. The choice was clear: resist and be branded difficult, or yield and keep her dignity, such as it was. She glanced out the window again. The clouds were gathering, and she was about to fall through them. Sierra didn't move. She sat perfectly still in seat 2A, her eyes fixed on the polished wood grain of the side console next to her. Marla, the flight attendant, still stood expectantly in the aisle. Preston Hale shifted his weight with performative patience, a soft sigh escaping his lips. Lena Kingsley was now fully seated in 2B, flipping through the wine list like the decision had already been made. "This is just embarrassing," Preston muttered under his breath. "Not low enough to be missed." Sierra folded her hands in her lap. She had practiced for every possible scenario this trip. Delays, jet lag, even the possibility of her luggage not making it to Zurich. But not this. Not being asked to move from a seat that was hers. Not being challenged like she was some kind of intruder in a space she had rightfully earned. "I'm sorry," Sierra said quietly, "but this is my seat." Marla gave her a thin smile, the kind that said she didn't want trouble, but had already chosen which direction she'd rather the trouble flow. "I understand this is frustrating," Marla said with syrupy professionalism, "but Mr. Hale is one of our most valued passengers, and we really do need to close the cabin for departure." Preston gave a dramatic glance toward the galley. "We've got 7 minutes until pushback." "Right. Maybe she can just be rescheduled. Or there's got to be an open seat in the back." The words stung, not just for their cruelty, but for the assumption behind them. The back, where she belonged, where people like her belonged. Sierra inhaled slowly. Her mother had always told her that when people don't expect you to be where you are, they will do everything to remind you. And if you react, even once, with anger or defiance, you become the problem. She opened her mouth to speak again, but stopped when a second attendant appeared. A younger woman with short auburn hair and concerned eyes. "Marla," she said, voice hushed. "Should we maybe check the manifest again?" Marla shook her head. "No need. I'll just reseat Ms. Morgan and flag it for the captain. They'll sort it post-takeoff." The younger attendant hesitated, then turned and walked away. Sierra's heart was thudding hard now. She looked at Marla, hoping to find some measure of understanding. But the older woman's eyes had gone cold. "Ms. Morgan." "Please gather your belongings," Marla said softly. "You're delaying our departure." Sierra reached down and picked up her backpack. Her fingers gripped the fabric tightly. The pressure against her chest made it feel like she was breathing through cotton. She stood slowly, not because she agreed, not because she gave in, but because the choice had already been made for her. She didn't trust herself to say another word. As she stepped into the aisle, Marla gave a practiced nod and gestured toward the back of the aircraft. Sierra turned her head to glance at Lena and Preston. Lena didn't look up from her phone. Preston, meanwhile, offered a half-smile that barely masked satisfaction. The moment burned into Sierra's memory like acid. The long walk from first class to economy was lined with curious eyes. Some passengers looked down, some looked through her. A few looked at her with something like sympathy, but no one said a word. By the time she reached row 38, her legs felt heavy. A man in a rumpled hoodie was already asleep in the aisle seat, mouth open, his head bobbing gently with the rhythm of his breathing. The middle seat was hers. A woman with a restless toddler sat at the window, trying to uncap a bottle with one hand while adjusting her child's socks with the other. Sierra squeezed in, careful not to bump either of them. She tucked her backpack under the seat and sat stiffly, knees nearly touching the seat ahead. The contrast was brutal. The wide leather seat in 2A had become a memory. This was real. This was cramped, loud, and smelled faintly of baby wipes and stale pretzels. She stared at her lap, her presentation folder still clutched tightly to her chest. A flight attendant passed by, and she wanted to ask again, to assert herself, but her voice had curled up inside her chest like a wounded animal. She felt small, smaller than she had felt in years. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Aerolite Flight 212 to Zurich. We are moments away from closing the cabin doors. Flight time today will be 9 hours and 22 minutes. Please ensure all carry-ons are stowed and your seat belts fastened. Sierra closed her eyes. 9 hours. She would be in this seat for 9 hours. She tried to push the thought away. Focus on the summit. Focus on her slides, her research, her future. But the humiliation kept rising, a wave she couldn't hold back. Her father had told her the world was not always kind to women like her, not even when they were exceptional, especially not then. He had said there would be days when she would have to bite her tongue to keep her teeth, but he had never said it would feel like this. The plane jolted as the door sealed. The engine hum deepened. The pushback began. In first class. Preston reclined slightly, sipping champagne. "To knowing how the system works," he said, raising his glass toward Lena. She giggled, toasting back. "You're just confident, babe. Some people find that intimidating." He laughed. "It's not my fault they're confused about where they belong." In the back. Sierra finally exhaled the breath she'd been holding since she stood up. The toddler next to her began to cry, a sharp whine that pierced her skull. The man in the aisle seat shifted in his sleep and leaned into her space. Her elbows tightened to her ribs. She had never felt so completely alone. She pressed her forehead gently against the back of the seat in front of her and let the thrum of the engines drown out the static in her mind. Her fingers touched the zipper of her folder, as if to reassure herself that the work inside was still real. She had done everything right. She had earned that seat, and still, they had taken it from her. The plane climbed through a veil of cotton clouds, leveling off as the soft chime signaled cruising altitude. Flight attendants unlatched carts in the galley, and the cabin lights shifted to a gentle amber glow. In the first-class cabin, glasses clinked and voices murmured over cloth napkins and imported wine. 36 rows behind. In seat 38B. Sierra Morgan sat still, her back stiff against the upright seat, her knees grazing the tray table in front of her. The man to her left had fallen into a deeper sleep, head bobbing toward her shoulder. To her right, the baby had finally quieted, resting on its mother's chest. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Sierra's fingers played with the corner of her presentation folder, tracing the edge over and over. Her name was printed on the front cover in bold black ink. Her title below it, Guest Presenter, International Youth Tech Summit. Her eyes skimmed the page again, as if it would tether her back to herself. The words blurred, not from motion, but from the sting she was fighting behind her eyes. She hadn't cried yet. Not when Marla asked her to move. Not when Preston smirked. Not when the passengers watched without speaking. But now, tucked between two strangers, her breath was becoming shallow. Her chest felt constricted. She wasn't angry. At least not only that. She felt displaced, like she had been uninvited from a space she had already paid for. And the worst part was that no one would see it that way. They'd see her as just another seat adjustment, another logistical mix-up. Not what it truly was. A quiet reminder. Know your place. She turned her face to the small oval window. Beyond it, endless sky stretched out like untouched paper. The clouds below were thick and glowing with dusk light. From here, the world looked peaceful. But inside, she was breaking. Her phone buzzed in her hoodie pocket. A message. Dad just landed. In Seattle. Everything okay on your end? Her fingers froze. She hadn't told him what happened yet. What could she say? That she'd been moved from first class to a middle seat in the back of the plane because a rich white boy didn't believe she belonged up front. That the flight attendant chose convenience over fairness. She typed slowly. staring at each word. "Sierra, I'm on board. Long story. Talk when I land." 3 little dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared again. "Gregory, okay. I'll be in Zurich early. Wanted to surprise you. Let's get breakfast before the summit." She read the message 3 times. A surprise visit. Her dad almost never traveled without telling her. He was the kind of man who planned everything with military precision. For him to be on his way to Zurich without her knowing meant he had been planning something special. She closed the chat window. Her phone screen went black. She slipped it into the mesh pouch in front of her and stared forward again. In first class. Preston Hale stretched his legs out under the polished footrest. He swirled the last of his champagne, reclined his seat slightly, and let out a satisfied sigh. "That was wild," he said. "Lena, flipping through a fashion magazine. Didn't look up." "Did you see her face?" Preston added, almost laughing. "I swear, for a second, she looked like she was gonna cry." Lena raised her eyes slowly. She probably just didn't want the attention. She didn't belong up here. That was obvious. Preston reached for a chocolate truffle from the tray in front of him. "I mean, come on. A kid." In first class, Lena closed her magazine. "You don't know who she is. For all we know, she could be someone important." "Sure," he said, chuckling. "And I'm flying coach next week." Lena didn't smile. Her gaze lingered on him a moment longer than usual, a flicker of doubt clouding her usual adoration. Then she turned toward the window. Preston rolled his eyes and signaled for Marla, who arrived quickly with another bottle of sparkling water. "Could you check if the Wi-Fi is up?" he asked. "I need to send a few emails before dinner." Marla nodded with a polished smile. "Of course, Mr. Hale. I'll reset the network." He gave her a wink. "You've been amazing. By the way, handling that situation earlier, total pro." She smiled, but her eyes darted briefly to the curtain separating the cabins. A flicker of something doubt, guilt, maybe moved across her expression, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I just try to keep things moving smoothly," she said. "It's important to avoid disruptions." "Exactly," Preston agreed. "Can't let one person delay the rest of us." In the back, Sierra had managed to extract her tablet from her backpack without waking the sleeping man beside her. She opened her presentation again and tried to focus on the second slide. Ethical bias in early-stage algorithm design. She read the same sentence 6 times before she gave up. Her mind kept drifting back to the moment she stood up, to the silence in the cabin, to Marla's voice. "We really need to close the cabin for departure." Sierra's mother had once told her that injustice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, draped in smiles, delivered with apologies. And it was in those moments, the small humiliations, where a person's strength was truly tested. She looked at her reflection in the black screen of her tablet. Her face was calm, too calm, like it belonged to someone else. What would she say to the press if someone had filmed that? Would anyone have cared? She imagined the comments. Probably a mistake. She's overreacting. They offered her another seat. Why make everything about race? But it wasn't about the seat. It was about what it meant. She had spent her life building a mind sharp enough to be invited to speak to some of the most brilliant people in her field. But none of that mattered to Preston Hale. All he saw was a young black girl sitting in what he believed was his space. And the airline? The airline saw his status before her ticket. That's what hurt the most. Not just being displaced, being erased. The cart came by and paused. A different attendant, one she hadn't seen before, offered her a drink. Sierra asked for water. "Sure thing," the woman said, pouring carefully into a plastic cup. "It's a full flight tonight." "Huh?" Sierra nodded, forcing a polite smile. The attendant hesitated. "I saw you earlier. In first class. I thought... Never mind." Sierra's eyes met hers. "I just thought they made a mistake." The woman finished softly. "That's all." Sierra said nothing, but something in her expression made the woman nod and quietly move on. Outside the window, the stars were beginning to appear. Somewhere up ahead, Zurich was waiting, but right now, Sierra Morgan sat 38 rows behind where she was supposed to be, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was falling slowly, painfully, through a world that still refused to believe she had already earned her place among the stars. 15 minutes. That was how long it had been since the cabin door had closed. Since Sierra Morgan was quietly escorted from the front of the plane and placed in a middle seat that didn't recline. Since her back started aching and her spirit began unraveling in slow, unnoticeable ways. 15 minutes felt like a lifetime when you were holding down the screen building inside your chest. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to dip behind a blanket of clouds, casting golden-orange hues across the endless Pacific horizon. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed, preparing passengers for the long-haul flight ahead. The infant beside her had settled into sleep, snuggled into their mother's arms. The man in the aisle seat continued to snore, his head occasionally brushing Sierra's shoulder. She didn't move, not because she was comfortable, but because she didn't want to draw more attention. Her mind kept replaying the moment she stood up from 2A, the subtle shift in atmosphere, the silence of the passengers, the smile Marla wore that masked something far colder underneath, and Preston's smug expression like he had done the world a favor. She hated that it stayed with her. She hated even more that part of her questioned whether she should have done anything differently. Should she have fought harder? Should she have demanded a supervisor? Was she being too polite in the face of something so clearly wrong? But the moment had passed. Now here she was, knees crammed, elbow tucked, counting the seconds. She pulled her hoodie's collar higher, partly to block the air vent that was blowing too cold and partly to shield herself from the glances. Even back here, people had noticed the shuffle. They had seen her walk the length of the cabin in silence, past leather seats and champagne flutes, past polished shoes and curated playlists. No one had spoken up. Not then. Not now. Her phone was still tucked in the seat pocket. She hadn't replied to her father's last message. He'd asked if everything was okay. She didn't know how to answer that. She heard once that when something unjust happens, the body remembers it even after the mind tries to forget. It burrows beneath the skin. It changes posture, breathing, even silence. Sierra could feel that now. Her body had gone quiet, but inside, her blood pulsed with a different rhythm. Slower, heavier. Meanwhile, in first class, Preston had just finished his second glass of champagne. He laughed as Lena pulled out her phone and snapped a selfie of them. He leaned in, angling his jaw. "Caption it?" he said. Something like, "En route to Zurich with the most beautiful distraction on earth." Lena smirked, typing away. Marla passed through the cabin, checking on passengers. She stopped briefly by Preston. "Everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Hale." "Perfect," Preston said. "Smoothest boarding ever." Marla smiled, though her eyes flicked briefly toward the front curtain. For the first time since takeoff, something in her expression cracked. A twitch, a shadow of discomfort. but it vanished before it could be named. Lena looked up from her phone. "You think that girl is going to make a fuss when we land?" Preston leaned back. "She's just a kid. What's she going to do?" "File a complaint." Lena shrugged. "You never know these days. People record everything. You might be a meme by morning." "Then I hope I look good in it," he said with a wink. "In the back." Sierra reached into her bag and retrieved her notebook. It wasn't digital, just an old paper journal she carried for thoughts that didn't belong in typed fonts. She flipped to a clean page and stared at it for a while before writing in small, neat handwriting. "I didn't lose the seat. They lost their integrity. I didn't leave quietly. I held my fire." She closed the journal. Then, just as she settled it back into her backpack, the overhead chime sounded again. "Cabin crew, please prepare for final door closure." The voice over the intercom said, but the door had already closed 15 minutes ago. Sierra looked up. So did the flight attendants nearby. Something was happening. The forward cabin door opened with a loud metallic click. Several heads turned. Whispers rose. A gate agent stepped through, accompanied by someone in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to cut through the stale cabin air like a knife. He was tall, mid-50s, broad-shouldered but lean. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back neatly. His shoes were polished but understated. His presence alone hushed the space around him. Gregory Morgan didn't need an introduction. Passengers in first class immediately straightened. Flight attendants paused mid-movement. Even Marla, who had been collecting empty glasses, stiffened like she'd been caught doing something wrong. Preston blinked in surprise. Dad Gregory didn't reply. He didn't even look at him. He turned instead to the closest attendant. "Not Marla. A younger woman." "I'm looking for Sierra Morgan," he said. "She was seated in 2A. The attendant's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Gregory's tone didn't rise, but the steel behind it was unmistakable. "Where is she?" Marla finally approached. She offered her most composed expression, but her voice faltered slightly. "There was a seating issue, sir. A double booking. We resolved it quickly." The young lady was reseated in premium economy. Gregory tilted his head slowly, as if trying to process a language that made no sense. "You moved Sierra Morgan," he repeated, "from the seat I personally arranged through corporate sponsorship, a seat booked under my company's account." Marla nodded, swallowing. Gregory's jaw tensed. His voice remained quiet. "And who made that decision?" Marla hesitated. "She was asked to move to avoid delay," she said. "Mr. Whale had a status designation." Gregory turned, finally meeting his son's eyes. The disappointment in that look was crushing. Preston's smirk faltered. "Dad," he said quickly, "it wasn't like that. She was just being difficult." Gregory ignored him. He looked back at Marla. "Where exactly did you place my daughter?" "Row 38, seat B," she said. Her voice was barely audible now. Without another word, Gregory turned and began walking. The aisle cleared like the parting of the sea. Passengers leaned out of their seats to watch him pass. He moved with a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, but carried weight, purpose. Sierra, seated in 38B, looked up when she heard her name being spoken by a familiar voice. She blinked twice. Gregory stood before her, not like the towering corporate figure the world knew, but like the father who used to carry her on his shoulders through science museums, the man who read her bedtime books about black holes and binary code. "Hey, baby girl," he said, softly. Her chest tightened. She couldn't speak. "I need you to come with me," he said. "Now." Sierra nodded. She rose, grabbing her backpack and presentation folder. The man in the aisle seat woke with a start as they stepped past him. The entire cabin watched as Sierra walked beside her father, the two of them cutting a line through rows of indifference and discomfort. Marla was waiting near the curtain. Gregory didn't stop. Neither did Sierra. Together, they stepped back into first class. And every eye was on them. The cabin had never been quieter. Every conversation stopped the moment Gregory Morgan stepped through the curtain with Sierra walking beside him. There was no announcement, no raised voice, and no security. Just presence. His presence. It was the kind that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it by simply existing. Sierra kept her eyes forward. Her heart thudded with a confusing blend of relief and unease. This wasn't how she wanted him to find out. Not in front of an audience, not like this. But now, with each step toward the front of the cabin, the weight she'd been carrying began to shift. Gregory stopped just short of row 2. His eyes landed on the empty seat by the window. Sierra's seat, Preston Hale, seated comfortably in 2B, looked up with a mix of confusion and discomfort. He knew something was wrong. That much was clear from his face. But he didn't know how wrong it was going to get. Lena Kingsley stared at her phone, suddenly far more interested in her notifications than the situation unfolding around her. Gregory turned to Sierra. His voice was quiet, but it filled the space like thunder wrapped in velvet. "Take your seat, Sierra." She hesitated for half a breath, then nodded. She stepped past Lena, who pulled her legs in without looking up, and sank gently into 2A. It felt surreal, like the seat had been waiting for her return, like it remembered her. Gregory didn't sit down. Instead, he turned fully to face Preston. For a moment, no one breathed. Preston rose to his feet, clearly trying to salvage control of the moment. "Mr. Morgan," he said, attempting a friendly tone. "I didn't realize you were on this flight." Gregory stared at him without responding. Just stared. Long enough that Preston began shifting uncomfortably. "She was making a scene," Preston continued. "I didn't even know who she was." Gregory's eyebrows lifted slightly. He repeated. "I mean," Preston said quickly, "your daughter, Sierra." Gregory's voice was calm. Too calm. "You didn't know who she was, but you knew she didn't belong here." Preston opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Gregory took a small step closer. He wasn't tall in the way that threatened. He was tall in the way that reminded you he didn't need to try. He was already above you. "You looked at a 17-year-old black girl," Gregory said, his tone never rising, "and assumed her presence here was a mistake. She was sitting in my seat," Preston said, defensively now. Gregory turned to Marla Fennick, who had crept forward like someone trying to fix a fire with a glass of water. "Is that true?" he asked her. Marla straightened. "There was a duplicate booking, sir. I verified the boarding passes. Both were valid. I made the call to reseat Miss Morgan to avoid delaying the flight." "You reseated a confirmed ticket holder," Gregory said slowly, "to appease someone with status." Marla swallowed hard. "I believed it was the quickest solution." Gregory's eyes narrowed. The quickest solution to what? Exactly. There was no answer. Sierra watched silently. Every passenger in first class was watching too. Champagne glasses sat untouched. Magazines held mid-air. The tension wasn't loud, but it buzzed like electricity between steel. "You see," Gregory continued, looking at Preston again, "I've spent 20 years building a company from the ground up, and I built it on the principle that intelligence doesn't wear one face. It doesn't come from one background. It doesn't check your last name or your zip code. It shows up where it's nurtured, where it's believed in. He gestured toward Sierra. This young woman has authored a paper that's about to change the way ethical coding is taught in AI development. Her research is already being cited in university classrooms, and instead of welcoming her presence in this cabin, you mocked it. Preston looked down. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Gregory didn't flinch. "Look at her when you say it." Preston's eyes reluctantly lifted to Sierra's. She didn't blink. "I'm sorry," he said again, barely louder. Sierra nodded once. Not out of forgiveness, just acknowledgement. The kind that says, "I heard you, but I haven't forgotten." Gregory turned back to Marla. "As for you," he said, "I understand how airlines work. I understand customer loyalty and status. But when you're presented with 2 boarding passes for the same seat, and you see a young woman with a valid claim and no history of conflict, and a man who challenges her presence not with facts, but with entitlement, the right choice is not convenience. The right choice is courage." Marla said nothing. Gregory's voice softened then, and somehow became even more powerful. "The worst part is that none of this surprises me, because I've watched it happen again and again, and I've told my daughter that one day the world would catch up to her. But not today. Today, it was your job to protect her dignity, and you failed." A heavy silence fell again, the kind that doesn't break easily. Gregory finally looked at the other flight attendant, the younger one who had tried, but had been ignored. "Is there a middle seat in row 38 still available?" She blinked. "Yep, sir." "There is." Gregory turned to Preston. "You'll sit there for the remainder of this flight. Miss Kingsley is welcome to accompany you or remain here, but I won't see my daughter displaced again." Preston stood motionless. His mouth opened as if to protest, but closed again without a word. Gregory didn't need to say it twice. With a defeated nod, Preston picked up his designer bag. Lena stood too, wordless. The 2 of them made their way past the curtain, down the aisle, and disappeared into the economy cabin. The moment they were gone, Gregory finally sat down beside Sierra. She stared ahead for a moment before turning to him. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "I did." There was no pride in his tone, no arrogance, just truth. "I was handling it," Sierra said. Gregory nodded. "I know you were." They sat in silence for a few seconds. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small chocolate bar wrapped in gold foil, the kind Sierra liked. He placed it on her tray table like it was a peace offering. She laughed softly, finally exhaling the tension she'd been holding for over an hour. The cabin remained quiet. A flight attendant approached and offered them fresh drinks. Sierra declined. Gregory accepted a glass of still water. They didn't need to talk anymore. The point had been made. And for the first time since boarding, Sierra felt like she wasn't just occupying a seat. She was seen. Sierra sat in her rightful seat. Taitue, looking out the window as the plane cruised through a sea of stars and silent blue-black sky. The cabin had not returned to normal. It couldn't. Not after what had just happened. Not after the quiet eruption that had restructured the balance of the entire flight. It was the same cabin, same seats, same soft lighting and linen napkins. But everything felt altered now. She was back in her seat. Her father was beside her, and everyone else was silent. Gregory didn't speak for a while. He sipped his water slowly, folding and unfolding the paper napkin in his lap. When he finally turned to her, there was no anger in his face, no condescension, just the tired expression of a man who had witnessed this kind of moment too many times in too many forms. "How long were you sitting back there?" he asked quietly. 15 minutes, Sierra said, her voice low. Gregory exhaled. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. He didn't ask the next question, the one about why she hadn't called, why she hadn't stood up for herself louder, because he already knew the answer. She had been taught her whole life how to move quietly through doors that might close, how to make herself small in rooms where her presence was questioned, how to choose grace over outrage. He hated that she'd had to learn that. "I didn't want to cause a scene," she finally said. Gregory nodded. "You didn't." "They did." Sierra turned to face him. "Do you think I was weak?" she asked. Gregory looked startled by the question. "No," he said. "I think you were trying to protect something. Your energy, your dignity. There's a difference between being silent and being small." Sierra looked back out the window. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. She didn't look broken. She looked composed. But inside, she was still sorting through the fragments of that walk to the back, that quiet removal. "I kept thinking," she said, "that if I fought it, I'd look angry, unreasonable, like the stereotype." Gregory placed his hand gently over hers. "You've carried too much of the world's burden on your shoulders already," he said. "The fact that you even think that way is the problem. Not you." A flight attendant appeared at their side. Not Marla. A younger woman, the one who had tried to intervene earlier. Her face was drawn but kind. "Mr. Morgan," she said. "Ms. Morgan, can I offer you something to eat? We're serving now." Sierra hesitated. She hadn't even thought about food. Gregory looked at her. "You should eat. Big day tomorrow." Sierra nodded and accepted the tray. A beautifully plated meal appeared in front of her, too elegant to feel like airplane food, but she barely touched it. Her appetite was still somewhere in row 38. Across the aisle, passengers averted their gazes. No one made eye contact, not even the man in 1D who had earlier chuckled at Preston's remarks. He now stared straight ahead, chewing slowly, like a student pretending not to notice the teacher in the room. There was no laughter, no casual banter, just the soft sounds of forks scraping porcelain and the quiet buzz of embarrassment too thick to name. Sierra cut into a piece of roasted chicken and took a small bite. Her stomach turned at first, but she forced herself to swallow. She needed strength, not just for the summit, but for herself. "What made you come early?" she asked her father between bites. Gregory smiled faintly. "I wanted to surprise you. I rearranged meetings so I could attend your keynote. Thought it might make you less nervous." She smirked. "You mean more nervous?" "Fair enough." He chuckled. "But I also wanted to be there the moment you stepped onto that stage. You've worked too hard to walk into that alone." Sierra looked down at her lap. "I almost didn't feel like I deserved it anymore." "After what happened?" Gregory leaned back. "Let me be very clear. You did nothing wrong. The only thing that happened was the world catching up to the reality you live in every day. And when that happens, it always tries to make you question yourself first." Sierra nodded slowly. He continued, "But they're not questioning you. They're trying to make sense of a world where a girl like you has already earned more than they ever expected. That's their crisis, not yours." The words wrapped around her like armor, not heavy, protective, reinforcing the core of who she was. "Dad," she said after a pause, "you didn't have to confront him like that." Gregory shrugged. "Yes, I did." "What if he retaliates?" Gregory raised an eyebrow. Preston Hale is the son of a man who once tried to get my company blacklisted from a federal contract because I wouldn't sell him proprietary AI rights. He doesn't scare me. Sierra's mouth opened slightly in surprise. Really, Gregory nodded. Really. And now, his son just made a public display of that same entitlement. The universe has a strange sense of symmetry. They both smiled. Back in economy, the world looked very different. Preston sat hunched in the middle seat of row 38, his long legs squeezed in awkwardly between the seats in front of him. The overhead fan blew too cold, and the crying baby 2 rows back had started again. His AirPods had died 20 minutes earlier. Lena was silent beside him, arms crossed, looking as far away from him as possible without physically leaving the row. She hadn't said a word since they were asked to move. Now, she finally turned her head toward him. "You embarrassed me," she whispered sharply. Preston blinked. "Me, yes you," Lena said. "That whole thing, you didn't just make a fool of yourself. You dragged me into it." Preston scoffed. "I didn't know who she was." "That's the point," Lena snapped. "You didn't even stop to wonder. You just assumed. And now you're sitting here, and your father just watched the CEO of a global tech company humiliate you in front of an entire flight." She turned away again. "I'm rethinking things." Preston. He didn't answer. What could he say? Nothing about this felt real. Just an hour ago, he had been sipping champagne and bragging about how easy life could be when you knew how to work the system. Now he was in row 38, seat B, wedged between strangers and carrying the weight of his own name like a curse. The flight attendants had stopped making eye contact. He was no longer a platinum passenger. He was just another problem to be avoided. Back in first class, Sierra leaned her head against the window. The clouds parted to reveal a stretch of night sky glittering with stars. She imagined what it might be like to build machines that could reach them, to navigate by ethics and algorithms instead of bias and assumptions. Her reflection looked calm again. But this time, it wasn't the mask she had worn in the back. This calm came from something else. Reclamation. This was her seat. And she had returned not by rage or force, but by the quiet insistence of truth. It felt like a small kind of justice. But justice, like the sky, was made up of many layers, and she was just getting started. Gregory Morgan rarely used his name to demand things. He preferred to let his work speak, his silence guide, his impact resonate in rooms long after he left them. But tonight, watching his daughter quietly collect herself in seat 2A, he knew this flight could not end with dignity restored in private, because the offense had been public. The humiliation had been on display. And if there was one thing Gregory Morgan had learned in his decades building a billion-dollar company, brick by ethical brick, it was this: silence in the face of systemic failure is consent. He removed his laptop from his briefcase and powered it on. As the soft glow of the screen lit up his face, Sierra turned and watched him. "What are you doing?" she asked. Gregory didn't look up. "Drafting an email." "To who?" He glanced at her, and a corner of his mouth lifted. "To everyone." She said nothing, but something shifted in her posture. A slight drop of the shoulders, a loosening of tension. She knew what that meant. He wasn't just going to let this go. Not this time. Gregory began typing slowly, methodically, each word purposeful. He started with the facts. A minor boarding conflict in first class. 2 passengers assigned to seat 2A. One was a young black female scientist en route to represent the United States at an international conference. The other, the son of a banking executive. Both presented valid boarding passes. Only one was asked to move. He detailed the actions taken. The deference to status over confirmation. The assumption made based on appearance. The silence of the cabin. The reluctance of the crew to question bias when it came dressed in tailored suits and platinum cards. Then he outlined the company values of Airline International, pulled directly from their website. Diversity, equity, inclusion, excellence, he asked, gently but firmly. When those values had become optional, when the airline claimed to celebrate young trailblazers like Sierra, was that only in press releases and brochures, or did it show up in how they treated her when no one was watching? Finally, he copied the board of directors. Then he hit send. Sierra watched the whole time, not interrupting once. "You didn't have to do that," she said again, though this time it was softer. Gregory looked at her. "No," he replied. "I had to." In the rear of the plane, Preston Hale was still stewing. His posture had gone rigid, his arms crossed tightly, his foot tapping uncontrollably. Lena had barely spoken in an hour. The seat was unforgiving. The passengers beside him gave him no attention. There was no bubble of privilege to soften the experience, just recycled air and humbling silence. He hated it. He hated how it made him feel small. And more than that, he hated that Sierra had taken back what he felt was his. He couldn't articulate it, not in words that wouldn't make him sound exactly like what he was afraid to admit. Spoiled, entitled, wrong. His father's voice echoed in his mind. That was the worst part, the knowledge that somewhere in New York, Edgar Hale had probably already received the forwarded email. The press team would be circling. The shareholders would start whispering. All because of a seat. No, because of him, in first class. Sierra pulled out her notebook again. She turned to a fresh page. She didn't write equations this time. She wrote memories. The moment she first realized that grown men sometimes looked at her like she didn't belong in science clubs. The time her fifth-grade teacher had been surprised she used the word algorithm correctly. The internship where her manager had praised her articulation as if it were a rare skill. Now this. She titled the page, Patterns We Don't Talk About. Beside her, Gregory received a reply from the CEO of Airline International. It was fast. Too fast. "Mr. Morgan, we are deeply sorry to hear about the incident involving your daughter. Please know this does not reflect our values. I will personally investigate this matter and ensure appropriate action is taken. We value your continued support and the trust you've placed in our brand." Gregory read it twice. Then he closed the laptop. Sierra noticed. "That quick?" He nodded. "They're not responding to me. They're responding to risk." She understood. The difference between change made from accountability and change made from fear. The latter was quick. The former took courage. Another hour passed. Then another. The lights dimmed. Most passengers fell asleep. But Sierra stayed awake. She couldn't sleep. Not yet. Not with so much unfinished inside her. "I used to think," she whispered, "that I could outgrow this. That if I worked hard enough, built enough, proved myself enough, the world would stop trying to push me back into the shadows." Gregory didn't respond right away. He waited. "But it doesn't go away," she said. "It just finds new shapes." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we keep reshaping the world, too," he said. "One moment at a time." Sierra nodded. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. She wiped it away quickly. "Don't apologize for crying," Gregory said gently. "It doesn't make you weak." She smiled through it. "I'm not crying because I'm hurt. I'm crying because I'm tired." He nodded. "Then rest. We'll keep fighting when you wake up." The cabin fell quiet again. Sierra finally leaned her head back, her mind slowly giving way to exhaustion. But just before sleep took her, she thought about the little girl who once believed first class was a place you earned by excellence alone. And she promised herself that one day, that version of the world might actually exist. But for now, she would settle for this. A seat reclaimed, a truth spoken, a reckoning begun. When the wheels of the plane touched down in Zurich, the jolt shook Sierra from her sleep. The familiar weight of fatigue settled over her shoulders like a thick shawl. She blinked against the morning light seeping through the window and turned her head toward her father. Gregory was awake, arms crossed, knees forward. He had not slept. The seatbelt sign chimed on, then off. People began to gather their belongings, adjusting scarves, fixing hair, powering on phones. First class stirred back to life, but the usual energy was missing. There was no chatter, no buzz, only the uneasy silence of a cabin that had seen something it couldn't unsee. Sierra stayed still. She looked out the window as the plane taxied toward the terminal. Snow dusted the tarmac in soft ripples. Beyond the glass, Zurich was waking up in monochrome. "Ready?" Gregory asked gently. She nodded. As passengers stood, some stealing sideways glances. Gregory remained seated until Sierra gathered her things, her laptop, her small carry-on, her leather-bound notebook. Only when she was ready did he rise. The curtain between first class and economy remained open. Sierra could see Preston seated in row 38 slouched low with his hood up, trying to make himself disappear. Lena sat next to him, silent, her phone gripped tightly in one hand. Neither looked toward her, but she saw them anyway. She didn't feel smug. She felt steady. Gregory led the way off the plane, stepping into the breezeway with a calm that made the gate agents straighten instinctively. A man in a black coat stood at the door holding a name card that read Morgan. He looked at Gregory and then quickly lowered the card. "Your car is waiting," he said. "Right this way." As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Sierra inhaled the cool air. It was sharp, clean, and full of something she hadn't felt since before boarding. Possibility. A few minutes later, they entered the private terminal lounge reserved for VIP conference guests. A tall man with silver hair approached them, flanked by two assistants with matching clipboards. His smile was wide, but tentative. "Mr. Morgan," he said. "Welcome to Zurich. And Ms. Morgan, an absolute honor." Sierra shook his hand politely. "I trust your flight was smooth," the man said, searching Gregory's face for signals. Gregory offered a diplomatic nod. "It was enlightening." The man cleared his throat and shifted. "We've prepared a reception area for your daughter. Light refreshments. A press booth will be ready after her keynote." Sierra raised an eyebrow. "Press. Yes, of course. Word of your attendance has traveled fast. The Youth Tech Summit issued a formal announcement just this morning. You're trending already." Sierra blinked. Trending for what? The man smiled nervously. "I imagine your work, but perhaps also other things." Gregory's phone buzzed. He checked it. Aerolite International had just issued a public apology. Sierra's photo was attached. A headline read, "Youth AI Scholar Removed from First Class in Error. CEO's Response Sparks Industry Backlash." Gregory showed her the screen. Sierra stared at it for a long time. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't proud either. The story had been reduced to a headline. The nuances, the silence, the humiliation, the restraint were flattened into an incident. Clickable, shareable, marketable. "Are you okay?" Gregory asked. She nodded slowly. "I will be." Inside the lounge, a handwritten letter sat on a white linen tablecloth next to a carafe of water and a small plate of lemon cookies. Her name was written in elegant script across the envelope. Sierra Morgan. She picked it up cautiously. The envelope was embossed with the seal of the Helix Point Foundation, her father's nonprofit arm. She opened it. Inside was a single page. Dear Sierra, by the time you read this, you'll have landed in Zurich. I'll probably be sitting beside you, but I wanted you to have this without my voice coloring it. What happened on that flight was wrong, but more than that, it was common, too common. I wish I could say this will be the last time someone tries to make you feel smaller than you are. It won't be. But remember this. You don't owe anyone a smaller version of yourself to make them comfortable. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to speak. And when you choose silence, let it be your choice, not their convenience. This world will learn to see you as you are, or it will watch you build one where that vision is no longer optional. I am proud of you. Always. Love. Dad Sierra read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the front pocket of her notebook. She glanced up. Gregory was pretending not to watch her. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded. "For the record, I'm also proud of how you didn't let that moment break you." Sierra gave a faint smile. It didn't. It bent something, but it didn't break. He exhaled, relieved. A woman with a headset appeared at the entrance of the lounge. "Ms. Morgan, they're ready for you backstage. We have your slides loaded." Sierra stood and smoothed her jacket. As she walked toward the exit, Gregory placed a hand gently on her back and whispered, "Go show them what strength looks like." She nodded. "In the green room, just behind the stage." Sierra looked at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't see a victim. She saw a young woman carrying every ancestor who had ever been asked to sit in the back. She saw someone who had chosen grace, not because she lacked power, but because she knew when to use it. Her name was called. She stepped into the spotlight. Row 38 was the kind of place that reminded you the sky didn't always mean luxury. The seats were tight, the air stale, and the service scarce. Preston Hale, son of a banking dynasty, sat wedged between a college student who kept dozing off on his shoulder and an older woman with oversized headphones playing jazz at a steady leak. Neither offered a smile. Neither recognized him. Or if they did, they didn't care. The tray table in front of him was sticky. His knees pressed awkwardly into the seat ahead. The air vent above had been stuck open the entire flight, blowing cold air onto his scalp until he'd given up and put on his hoodie. He shifted again, trying to get comfortable. He couldn't. Lena sat in the aisle seat beside him, arms crossed, gaze locked on a fashion blog she pretended to scroll through. She hadn't spoken more than 2 full sentences to him since they were receipted hours ago. And Preston, usually so quick to deflect with charm or bravado, couldn't find the words this time. What could he say? That it was just a misunderstanding, that Sierra had overreacted, that his assumptions hadn't come from a place of malice, just instinct. That excuse felt weaker every time it echoed in his head. In the beginning, he told himself he didn't know who she was. That was true, but the deeper truth, the one he'd been trying to push away, was that it wouldn't have mattered if he had. He would have still questioned her, still doubted her, because in the world he grew up in, first class wasn't something you had to prove you deserved. It was something you inherited, something you were born into. something people like Sierra Morgan had to constantly earn, but were never allowed to truly own. He sighed and leaned back, pressing his head against the window. The hum of the engine became louder the farther he tried to distance himself from the thoughts crawling through his mind. Across the aisle, a teenage boy in a hoodie leaned toward his friend and whispered, not quietly enough, "That's the guy who got kicked out of first class." The friend snickered. Preston turned away. His phone buzzed. A text from his father. "Call me now." He ignored it, not because he wasn't afraid. He was, but because right now, facing Edgar Hale felt like a relief compared to the shame sitting in his own skin. Lena finally broke the silence. "You really don't get it, do you?" Preston turned to her slowly. "What, you still think you're the victim in all this?" He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "You embarrassed yourself. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed your family name. And not because you made a scene, but because you proved exactly what people already assume about guys like you." Preston looked at her, really looked. "And what's that?" Lena locked eyes with him. "That you don't see anyone outside your world as human until they force you to." Her words hit like turbulence. He sat back, stunned. Lena didn't blink. "You think charm and connections can fix everything. But what you did, assuming she was in the wrong, just because she didn't look like she belonged in your world, can't be undone with a sorry—" Preston swallowed. His throat felt dry. "Then what can?" he asked. Lena didn't answer, because she didn't know either. But the silence between them was no longer bitter. It was contemplative, like something was being rebuilt from rubble neither of them expected to fall. He looked out the window. Snow had started to fall in Zurich, small flakes clinging to the pane. It looked quiet out there. But inside, everything was noisy. His thoughts, his regret, his sudden awareness that maybe this was the first time in his life he had really been told no. And worse, that the no had come not from someone trying to put him down, but someone trying to stand up for someone else. In that moment, Preston remembered a conversation he had with his mother when he was 13. She had taken him to a fundraiser gala for inner-city STEM programs. She'd leaned over and whispered, "Privilege isn't about guilt, Preston. It's about responsibility. One day, I hope you'll use it to make someone else feel seen." He hadn't understood her then. He might be starting to now. The plane began its final descent. The flight attendants made their rounds, checking tray tables and seat backs. Preston sat up straighter, ran a hand over his face, and glanced down at his phone again. More texts from his father, another from someone at the firm, then one from a news outlet. He was trending too, not for his portfolio, not for his legacy, for a first-class seat he'd never deserved in the first place. When the wheels touched down, Preston didn't feel relief. He felt dread. The moment they were allowed to disembark, he remained in his seat. Lena grabbed her bag and stood without a word. She didn't wait for him. He didn't ask her to. Row 38 emptied slowly, and when Preston finally stepped out into the aisle, the looks started. People recognized him now, not as someone worth admiring, but as someone worth watching fall. He moved slowly, head down, past the cabin where Sierra had reclaimed her place. He glanced once at seat 2A. It was empty now, but the silence it left behind was thunderous. As he entered the jet bridge, he felt the gravity of the moment settle in his chest, like a weight he would carry far beyond this flight. And for the first time, he didn't try to shake it off. He let it stay. He let it teach. The grand ballroom of the Zurich Civic Pavilion was filled with soft light and the low hum of conversation. Banners stretched from ceiling to floor, each one bearing the Youth Tech Summit's core values in crisp type innovation, integrity, inclusion. Sierra stood at the edge of the backstage curtain, her fingers curled around a clipboard she didn't need. The audience beyond was a sea of global faces: scientists, tech executives, students, journalists, and sponsors. Rows of cameras lined the back wall. Her name had already been read once. A hush had fallen when the announcer said, "Representing the United States, the youngest AI ethics scholar in attendance." Then the room had erupted in applause. But applause could not silence her thoughts. Sierra had spoken in public before. She had presented at robotics conventions, participated in panels, led high school summits. But this was different. This wasn't just about code or logic models. This was about what she had come to symbolize. And that weight felt heavier than any she'd carried. Gregory sat in the front row, flanked by the summit's executive team and 2 Swiss government officials. His posture was relaxed, but his expression was attentive. He gave her a small nod when she peeked out. That was all she needed. The stage manager gave her the cue. She stepped forward into the light. The applause returned, louder this time, more sustained. She walked to the podium with measured steps, the room shifting from clapping to quiet in seconds. The spotlight warmed her shoulders. She adjusted the microphone. She waited, and then she spoke. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady but gentle. "My name is Sierra Morgan, and I study how artificial intelligence can learn ethics the same way people do. Not through cold programming, but through exposure, through patterns, through the systems that shape our choices, even when we think we're free." She let that hang for a beat. I was going to start this talk with a story about my project, about the work we're doing to prevent bias in autonomous systems. But something happened to me on my way here that changed everything I planned to say. There was a shift in the room. I was removed from my seat on an airplane, a seat I had paid for, checked into, confirmed. Why? Because someone assumed I didn't belong there. No one asked questions. No one double-checked. They just asked me to move, and I did. The silence grew thicker. I didn't fight. I didn't raise my voice. I just gathered my things and walked to the back of the plane. Not because I was wrong, but because I've been trained, like so many others, to minimize disruption in spaces that were never built for us. She paused, letting her gaze move across the room. Bias isn't always coded into machines. Sometimes it's coded into culture, into comfort, into the silence of those who know better but choose not to speak. Several people shifted in their seats. One sponsor's hand froze above his notepad. My work in AI is about building systems that recognize more than the data they're fed. Systems that can pause and ask, "What aren't we seeing?" Because that question can save lives. And maybe, just maybe, it can save us from ourselves. She took a breath. And if we want technology to reflect the best of us, we have to become better teachers, not just in how we program, but in how we live, in who we include, in what we allow. The applause came slowly at first, then stronger, and then it became a wave. Gregory stood. Others followed. It became a standing ovation. But Sierra didn't smile. Not yet. She stepped back from the microphone and allowed herself only a quiet moment of stillness before walking off stage. Backstage, the summit director was waiting for her, eyes wide, mouth parted in admiration. "That," he said, "was the most human keynote we've ever had." Sierra thanked him and kept walking. She found her father by the exit, hands in his pockets, the way he always stood when proud and pretending not to be. "That was brave," he said. "No," she replied. It was overdue. They left through the back corridor, avoiding the reporters waiting at the main entrance. Outside, the snow had thickened. Soft, silent flurries drifted through the golden glow of the street lamps. A black car waited for them at the curb, engine running. Before climbing in, Sierra stopped and looked up at the sky. The flakes landed on her eyelashes and melted slowly down her cheek. "What happens now?" she asked. Gregory followed her gaze. "That depends," he said. "Do you want to keep being a symbol, or do you want to build something that outlives the headlines?" Sierra considered it. "I think I want to build." "Then let's start with a letter." To who he smiled. To the ones watching from the back. Back at the hotel. Sierra wrote into the night. Not algorithms, not presentations, but a letter. One meant for every young person who had ever been told to step aside quietly. For every girl who had been stared at like a question mark. For every black student whose achievements came with a footnote of surprise. She published it at dawn. By mid-morning, the letter had gone viral. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was everyone's. Sierra hadn't expected the world to read her letter. She wrote it alone in a corner suite at the Hotel Adlerhof. Zurich still blanketed in sleep. There was no publicist, no press team, no carefully crafted tone. Just Sierra in her robe, her curls pulled back, laptop on her knees, and the same quiet certainty she felt on the plane when she reclaimed her seat. It began simply. To every young person who's ever been told, you must be mistaken. To every girl who's ever felt like an exception instead of a rule. To every black child asked, "Are you sure that's your seat?" It continued not as an accusation, but as an awakening. She spoke about patterns, about a world that teaches some to question and others to apologize, about the softness that is mistaken for weakness, and the courage it takes to hold your place when the world is asking you to leave it. By the time she pressed publish, the sun had begun to rise across the lake, a golden spill across the snow-lined balcony. Gregory stood behind her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I didn't want to," she replied. Within an hour, her inbox began filling with messages. Hundreds, then thousands. Some were from parents who had daughters like Sierra, others from teachers who had never known how to describe what their students faced until now. Some came from airline staff, quietly admitting they'd seen it too. A few came from high places, CEOs, senators, a presidential aide. But the one that stopped her came from a girl named Alana in Tulsa, Oklahoma. "Hi, Sierra. I'm 14, and I just read your letter. My mom printed it out and put it on our fridge. I wanted to tell you something. Last month, I tried to join the robotics team. One of the boys told me to try cheerleading instead. I almost listened, but now I won't. Thank you for reminding me I belong." Sierra read it aloud. Gregory listened without interrupting. They didn't speak for a long time after. Aerolite International issued a second, more pointed statement that afternoon. This time, it didn't come from the PR desk. It came from their CEO. "We failed Ms. Morgan, and we failed our crew by allowing bias to stand unchallenged. Effective immediately. We are reviewing our internal training procedures and forming an advisory board on passenger dignity standards." That line sparked its own ripple. Passenger dignity. The phrase took off like wildfire. Talk shows quoted it. Think pieces were published. TikToks were made explaining the Sierra Morgan incident frame by frame. Major airlines scrambled to respond, many updating their policies to address implicit bias in service procedures. But Sierra didn't gloat. She didn't post victory tweets. She didn't do the late-night circuit. Instead, She held a private Zoom call with 15 girls of color from underfunded STEM programs across the U.S. They had all written to her. She wanted to see their faces. She wanted them to see hers. They talked not about the incident, but about invention, about what they were building, about the bugs in their code and the biases in their classrooms. Sierra answered every question with patience, with joy, not as someone who had gone viral, but as someone who knew what it was like to need a lighthouse. She became theirs. At the end of the call, a girl named Naya from Detroit asked if Sierra planned to run a mentorship program. Sierra smiled. Maybe one day. Gregory overheard. After the call, he sat beside her on the couch. You know, he said, Helix Point could fund it. She looked at him, surprised. You'd do that? Of course, he replied. This isn't just about software anymore. It's about shaping a system that doesn't push back every time a girl like you steps forward. Sierra nodded, her eyes glistening. They named it the SEAT Initiative, a program to fund, mentor, and support young women of color pursuing tech, especially those who had been told they didn't belong. The tagline was simple, not an exception, an expectation. They launched the site 2 days later. Within a week, it had over 100 applications. Meanwhile, Sierra's letter was translated in 23 languages. Harvard requested to archive it in their digital civil rights collection. Time magazine called her the future of ethical tech. Teen Vogue called her the quiet storm. But Sierra didn't care for titles. She was more interested in making sure the next girl on a plane didn't have to carry her resume in her heart just to stay seated. And in the background, something else shifted. Airlight's board invited Gregory Morgan to consult on their newly forming Passenger Dignity Council. He declined the seat. Give it to someone younger, he said. I know a few names. In Seattle, the mother of a young black boy wrote an op-ed for the New York Times. When my son asked why someone would make Miss Sierra move, I didn't have an answer. But now, I can tell him that dignity isn't given by seats. It's reclaimed by voices. And hers is loud enough to carry us all forward. In Zurich, a quiet storm had started. But by now, it was circling the globe. And Sierra Morgan had no intention of letting it pass. Daltonson. The flight back to Seattle was quiet. No reporters, no cameras, just Sierra and Gregory tucked into their respective seats in row 2 of an evening flight cruising over the Atlantic. The lights were dimmed. The hum of the engines filled the silence. And this time, no one questioned Sierra's place. No one asked her to move. There was a different kind of hush in the cabin now. A reverent awareness. A stillness. Not out of fear, but respect. Even the crew walked with a measured grace. It was clear they knew who she was, not because of a viral clip, but because her presence now spoke louder than headlines. Sierra stared out the window, watching the endless spread of ocean give way to cloud cover. She had her headphones in, but the music wasn't playing. She was just thinking. Gregory glanced over from his seat. Tired? He asked quietly. A little, she replied, but it's the good kind, the kind that comes after building something, not breaking down. He nodded, understanding. Back in Zurich, the SEAT initiative had gone from concept to movement in less than 2 weeks. Donations poured in, companies volunteered mentors. A panel of advisors from universities and startups joined without being asked. Every girl who had ever second-guessed her voice now had a space where her instincts would be nurtured, not dismissed. Sierra, still just 17, had started drafting a curriculum, not just for girls, but for boys too, especially the ones like Preston. Gregory had suggested it gently. Teach the next Prestons how to see. Otherwise, they'll grow up thinking power is the same as wisdom. Sierra had agreed. She knew change meant reaching not just the overlooked, but the over-entitled. Bias wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. It came with smiles and suits and seats already waiting. She'd seen it. Now she wanted to dismantle it. The captain's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Seattle-Tacoma International in approximately 20 minutes. Local time is just past 9:00 p.m. and the skies are clear. We'd like to thank you for choosing Aerolite International." Sierra smiled faintly at that. Aerolite didn't choose her, but maybe, just maybe, it had begun to listen. They landed smoothly. A ground crew was already waiting, not for show, but for protocol. Sierra gathered her things and followed her father through the familiar corridors of the airport she'd once walked through, with a backpack full of robotics tools and dreams that felt just out of reach. But this time, she didn't feel like she was reaching. She felt rooted. As they approached Gate A7, Sierra paused. That was the gate from the flight, the one where it all started. She stood for a moment, just observing. The chairs, the monitors, the buzzing of boarding calls. No one noticed her, and she liked it that way, until a voice called out from behind the desk, "Miss Morgan." She turned. A young woman in an Aerolite blazer approached. Nervous, fidgety, but sincere. "My name's Jess. I'm a gate manager here. I just wanted to say, I read your letter, and I've been thinking about it ever since. About how many people I might have treated like they didn't belong. Not because I meant to, but because I didn't pause to ask." Sierra tilted her head gently. "And are you asking now?" Jess nodded. "Every day?" "Then keep going," Sierra said softly. "That's how it changes." Jess smiled, tears touching the edges of her eyes. She handed Sierra a small envelope. "This came for you. I don't know who dropped it off, but it had your name on it." Sierra took the envelope and nodded in thanks. She and Gregory walked to a nearby bench and sat. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. "Sierra, I owe you an apology. Not the public kind. The real kind. You didn't know me, but I thought I knew you. I saw a girl and assumed a threat to something I felt entitled to. A seat, a space, a world that always made room for me. I was wrong, and I've been spending the past few days trying to figure out how to unlearn that reflex. You didn't just take your seat back. You gave a generation permission to stop shrinking. Thank you." Preston Hale Sierra read it twice. Then she folded it, tucked it into her notebook, and stood. She didn't need to reply. He had begun his work. As she and Gregory walked out of the terminal, the crisp Seattle air wrapped around them. A new night, a new chapter. "What now?" Gregory asked. Sierra smiled. "Now we build the table." He laughed. "You mean so they don't just fight over seats?" "Exactly. No more scarcity. No more permission. Everyone gets a chair, especially the ones who've been standing the longest." They stepped into the waiting car, and as it pulled away from the curb, Sierra leaned her head against the window. Outside, the city lights blurred, but inside, everything had sharpened. She wasn't the girl who'd been kicked out of first class anymore. She was the girl who helped rewrite the map, not just for herself, but for all of them. Sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't come from shouting. They come from someone who refuses to shrink. Sierra Morgan didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She simply stood in the quiet storm of injustice and chose to respond with grace. truth, and strength. And through her, we witnessed a truth too many know, but too few say out loud, that racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it sits behind a gate, smiling while it pushes you aside. But what they didn't expect was who she was, what she carried, and how she would transform that humiliation into a movement. By the end of that flight, Sierra didn't just reclaim her seat. She became a voice for every girl who's ever been told she didn't belong. She showed us that justice isn't always loud. It's often patient, strategic, and devastatingly clear. Let this story remind us dignity isn't a luxury. It's a right. And no one should have to earn the humanity that should have been given freely. If Sierra's story moved you, if it made you think, or made you feel something deep inside, help us keep telling stories that matter. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support fuels every voice we amplify. And trust us, the next story might just be the one the world needs to hear next. Thank you for watching.